Welcome to the Late Republic Nonsense podcast, and I'm here with my very good friend Michael Anton from Hillsdale College and a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, and an all-around great guy who is probably one of the most influential voices on the right today. So we wanted to get I wanted to get a chance to talk and ask a few questions that Michael usually does not get, because I've seen, he's quite in demand as an interview guest, and I thought I could come up with a couple questions that he hasn't yet received, and let's see how it goes.
Okay.
So the first thing I want to ask is, what is a piece you've written a lot over the last several years? What is a piece that you kind of may reconsider?
You mean that I would do it differently, or I wouldn't do it at all?
Maybe maybe you were wrong. Maybe maybe you would do it differently with different emphasis.
It's an easy question to answer if we go back further than the last couple of years. I mean, the biggest thing I was wrong about, without any question whatsoever, is the Iraq War. You know? And I actually keep waiting. I don't hear this much. Maybe I shouldn't put this idea out into the bloodstream, but I keep waiting for someone sort of vaguely on our side to say, why should we listen to this guy at all? He was wrong about like the biggest thing of the 20th century. To which I would have to say, you kind of have a good point. You get something like, I mean, I'm usually the first one to say, if you're wrong about something that big, your judgment is bad. I guess in my defense, I would say, I figured it out. I figured out that I was wrong earlier than a lot of other people who are in that Bush orbit. And many others will never say that it was wrong or that it caused any second order problems. So, I guess if you don't want to listen to me because I was wrong about the Iraq War, you kind of have my permission. I don't know how else to put it. It's like, I would understand that. I'd be sad. I would say, I think I have some other things to say that are important that, you might get something out of, but I would kind of get it. On the Trump's big three, Iraq, trade, immigration, I was actually wrong about two of them. It's just that I was never that invested in trade. I never thought about it, wrote about it. I just took for granted the conservative position that open trade was the right way to go. I was a pretty early adopter to an immigration restrictionist stance, though, long before I was any kind of writing for the public or involved in politics. Way back in grad school, when California passed Prop 187, 1994. My friends, my fellow grad students, all the faculty, with one great exception, we were all for what Pete Wilson was trying to do and what the voters of the state of California were trying to do. So, sort of like when people say, well, Trump never had a consistent policy, about anything, they're not correct. They're right that he changed his mind and flopped around on many issues. But if you remember Donald Trump, when he really became a national figure in the late 80s, he was utterly consistent on the trade question from that point right up to the point he got elected and was president. So that's something that, he stuck to and motivated him his whole career. And I would just also say, like, look, if you don't change your mind about anything, you're probably just not thinking, you're not paying attention. Your brain has shut down at some point. So, but if you want to narrow it to the last few years, I don't know, maybe this is ego. Maybe I still think the basic points that I tried to bring out in 2015, 16 are correct. And I'm still pushing them now. So I don't know that I've changed my mind about any of that stuff.
Right. Well, I have a suggestion for you, and it's a blast from the past.
Okay.
It's Conservative Bohemia from
That's
the
way
Weekly
back
Standard. When. Yeah. It's way back when. It's 1995 in the Weekly Standard.
Grad school era.
Right. So you make the case that the right needs cities, or at least physical spaces where people can exchange ideas and kind of germinate together. In other words, like a scene, which is something that I talk about a lot. And you're talking about taking over, kind of taking over, but let's say the gentle version of occupying.
Or gentrification, we can call it conservatification, rightification. Imagine if conservatism had, a Greenwich Village type neighborhood where which the left can take for granted in most cities, where everybody they live near one another, they know one another, they go to the same restaurants and cafes, they're cross-pollinating constantly. So I don't know that I would walk away from that. I still think it would be great. I just think it's a fantasy. It's completely impossible. We've so badly lost the cities that it's almost not worth thinking about except as something far off in the future when the world is utterly changed and made anew. If that ever happens, then it's something to think about then. But for now, I mean, it's just
right. Well, I mean, I agree with that kind of the main thrust of the piece, which is that that's something that we need, and at the end of the day, we're going to need cities. We need cities, you know, just as a thing, you know, in our new country or in, you know, in Red America needs cities. It can't be exclusively rural. I think for the reasons that you mentioned, you know, but I don't think there's a reason why we can't apply some of these things that we want, some of the things that make these neighborhoods special, you know, the cross-pollination and all this stuff in, let's say, a red suburb.
You know, when I wrote that piece, Silicon Valley was just becoming a thing. That is to say, it had been around, you know, the semiconductor industry. There had been Apple Computer founded whenever it was founded in the 70s, and Hewlett Packard going back further than that. But that it, you know, the second half of the 90s was the run up to that first huge tech bubble that burst, the NASDAQ bubble that burst in 2000. And it was the first time you really felt the messianic spirit of the techies, the Netscape IPO in 1995. I think that same year, if I have that correct. And there was a lot of talk back then about the whole world going virtual, you know, and here we are doing a chat on virtually over the internet, right? And so it seems like that vision was vindicated, except that part of the piece was in kind of unconscious reaction to that, saying, no, the world can't ultimately be totally virtual. People are going to need to know each other and have face-to-face contact and be around one another for civilization to grow and to thrive and stuff like that. And I was kind of, you know, that piece grew out of my enjoyment of being in the cities in San Francisco and New York, and sort of a lament that, you know, we don't have our own kind of spaces like that. And also there was not a movement, but there were people making arguments at the time. I thought good arguments that we still hear echoes of today. It's like, well, you know, anybody who's smart on the right, either they just go into business or they end up in academia or in a think tank crunching numbers and writing policy papers. We don't have anybody writing short stories or songs or short film. We just don't do that, or we do it in desultory numbers, and we don't do it very well. And I thought, well, maybe one of the reasons we don't do that is because we don't have these little incubators, you know, in the cities that would help bring that stuff along and nurture it. And, you know, it was a kind of a whimsical piece. It wasn't
right. But
a serious proposition. It was sort of meant like kind of just dreaming, like, wouldn't this be cool if we could have this? And if we did, I would be very happy. I would love to live there.
Sure. No, me too. I mean, that's why, I mean, I think the piece resonated with me, even though it was kind of jokey and whimsical. You know, below the surface was a kind of, you know, profound idea.
Yeah.
And actually, what you just said leads me to the next question that I had, which is that, you know, even though you're lately best known as a polemicist, talking about politics, you've written about Tom Wolfe and the Beach Boys and California wine, and I mean, you've done these you know, really in depth and quite beautiful feature pieces.
Yeah.
That a lot of folks, you know, a lot of folks on the right have not done. I mean, I don't think there are more than, I don't know, 10 people on the right who can do real straight up feature pieces like that.
Yeah, those were fun to do, especially with the ones on Wolf, because I got to meet him and know him and hang out with him, you know, fairly extensively in the last, I think he died in 2018, about 3 years ago. And for the last like 5 years of his life, a little more than that, actually, I was around him quite a bit, and I got a lot out of it. It was a great honor just to meet a hero and then have the hero turn out, you know, everybody says like you build it up, you finally meet him and the person's either a jerk or just a dud. And he was neither. Like, he was the nicest man imaginable and absolutely hilarious and fun to be around and very generous with his time. You know, and some of it's just like, I just wrote about things that that are my bugaboos that I love. So like I wrote a piece about the 50th anniversary of The Twilight Zone, a show that I remember finding in, you know, UHF syndication when I was about 12, that my dad had watched in its first run, became utterly obsessed with it, like watched every single episode, read all about it. And I just, you know, did a bunch of research and wrote a 5,000 or 6,000 word piece on what the show meant, how Sterling created it, stuff like just things, or Sterling, sorry. Just things that were very personally interesting to me. There are some that, you know, I've never got around to doing. Like I talked to Brian Anderson of City Journal. Really, I've told him I'm going to write this piece for like 5 years, and I've never done it. I want to write a piece kind of about the history. Now, this story's been told a million times about the history of the atom bomb, the design and the making of it. But in particular, I have a thesis that it is a cause of the university going left, right? That is to say, the massive guilt, because the universities went all in on the Manhattan Project. There were scientists, you know, academics were highly involved. And my thesis is, and you can see this pretty plainly in some of the reminiscences of Oppenheimer and some others, but my thesis is that institutionally it causes an amazing amount of guilt because they all thought, oh my God, what have we done? Like we did this human knowledge that's meant to be to ennoble and uplift us. We put our services into this thing that now has the possibility to destroy the world. And it's given them this kind of incredible guilt complex that they haven't gotten over. And it's one of the reasons why, you know, I used to joke, I haven't been to Berkeley in a long time, but there are several approaches to Berkeley from the north and the south and off the bridge. And as you cross the border, there used to be, I assume and hope still are, this big sign that says you are entering a nuclear free zone, right? Which is ironic on two levels. One is there's an operating nuclear reactor in Strawberry Canyon. Maybe they shut it down, I don't know, but there was back then. And the second is this is literally the place that built the bomb. Like the University of California had the contract with the federal government to run the Manhattan Project. Oppenheimer was a Berkeley professor. So was Glenn Seaborg. So was Ernest Lawrence. I mean, I could go on and on and on. Glenn Seaborg discovered plutonium in Strawberry Canyon at that reactor, right? So like you're entering a nuclear free zone, which also happens to be the single most important spot in the world that invented the nuclear weapon.
That's amazing.
I think they feel very guilty about it and they haven't gotten over it.
Yeah. That's amazing. I mean, I don't think now they even know that history.
Yeah, they cover it up. I mean, they're ashamed of it, right? They're ashamed. I remember when I was in college, they made a movie called Fat Man and Little Boy with Paul Newman as Leslie Groves, who's the two-star general who oversaw the
I remember that movie, but I never saw it.
Manhattan Project. Yeah. And Leslie Groves is this big fat guy. I mean, super talented. He built the Pentagon, among other things. You know, on a crash schedule. But they get, you know, obviously the svelte and handsome Paul Newman, a bit of a, you know, there's Hollywood casting for you.
Right.
They got the guy who played, I forgot his name, Dwight Schultz, the guy who was the crazy guy on the A-Team. Remember who was he?
Yeah. Face.
No, Face was Dirk Benedict, right? Starbuck from Battlestar Galactica. Anyway, he was the sort of loony one who then becomes Lieutenant Barclay in the Star Trek franchise. Anyway, he played Oppenheimer. So they actually shot some scenes on the campus of this movie while I was in college, and even made a poster with the Campanile Sather Tower in the background at one point, and all of that. For whatever reason, did not make the final cut of the movie. The movie's honestly, it's not that great. I finally got around to seeing it years after it came out, and I was like, I can see why this wasn't such a big hit. It was a bomb to make a bad pun.
I mean, did it vilify?
No, just trying to tell the story. It's just,
that wouldn't exist today.
It was mostly, if it had a political agenda, the agenda was this poor tortured man, Oppenheimer, is being investigated by these mean feds because he might be a spy. And it, you know, and I don't know how many people know this, but like Oppenheimer got involved in a major controversy after the war over his loyalties. So they never were able to prove that he spied or did anything. Although people in the project absolutely spied and leaked knowledge and materials and stuff to the Soviets, but it divided the community that he had put together in Los Alamos. Some of whom, led by Edward Teller, thought that Oppenheimer was a traitor and wanted to get a security clearance pulled. It became a roiling controversy. But Oppenheimer definitely went way to the left after the war and regretted his role in the Manhattan Project and for building the bomb at all, which I'm very ambivalent. I've read tons and tons about this, and I would say the standard conservative position would be, you know, don't be weak-kneed. You know, this is a tough world. You got to have what you got to have. But I'm sort of a Reaganite when it comes to this. Reagan really hated nuclear. People forget this part of it. Like they think of him as the guy who built the MX missile and dialed up the military and all this. He really, really hated nuclear weapons to the point where his advisors got to the point where they doubted his willingness to retaliate if need be. And they thought that he might say something in public to that effect that would signal to the Soviets that the United States did not have a credible deterrent because the president lacked the will. And they had to sit him down at one point and say, Mr. President, look, whatever your private doubts, we sympathize, but you can't talk like this in public because you'll get the very outcome that you're trying to avoid if you keep saying.
Wow. When was this? I didn't hear about this.
Like 82.
Yeah. Interesting. No, that's fascinating. It's funny that we went this way. My next question is totally germane to this. So the difference between national security and foreign policy, and is it possible for a country like ours in 2021 that seems to be coming apart, that has no consensus about anything, to really have a foreign policy or a national security policy?
I just did an event yesterday for students and got a question like this, and it reminded me, which I know you saw. So in the summer, when Angelo was alive, Angelo Codevilla was supposed to teach the Lincoln Fellowship foreign policy sessions. And he got sick and he couldn't do it. And I took his place. I filled in for him. And he wrote a note to the fellows, very short note, basically saying, look, I can't tell you everything I would have said had I been there, but you did the reading. The main message I have for you is it's impossible for a country as divided as ours, as broken as ours, to have a consistent foreign policy when we don't even have a consistent domestic policy and we don't even have basic unity at home. And it was a simple point, but well delivered and very profound. And that's what I said to the students yesterday. And I still think it's right. Like, I mean, certainly when your country is this divided and this broken at home, an activist foreign policy seems insane and also just unsustainable, impossible to maintain. I would say, look, you always have to defend the border, although we don't do that, but a sane state would defend the border, right? You always have to do the kind of bare minimum, but in terms of resources, which would include politicians' time, I would say those are much better spent in the present environment on fixing problems at home. I just read an article just before hopping on here, yet another piece about the supply chain crisis. Now, this is giant systems, complex. I'm certainly no expert on them, but this was a fairly plausible case where the guy was saying, look, this is a cascade failure effect, and it's not going to be over in a month or even in a year. This is going to take many years to sort out, and there's going to be a lot of pain before it's all sorted out, which is sad and depressing, and I hope wrong. I hope it's just a bad take or inaccurate. I don't think the guy's operating in bad faith, but if that's true, and to the extent that it's true, let's get to work on that before we start thinking about what the next country we're going to try to foment a democratic revolution in, which is insane given the problems we have at home.
Right. No, I agree. And when I came to that realization,
I say democratic, by the way.
Yeah. When I came to that realization that that at the end of the day, a lot of the things that because I've got let's say conservative activist national security background, and when I realized that a lot of the things that had occupied my time, energy, and mind, imagination, what have you, for all these years, end up being, let's say, less relevant than I thought they were.
No, someone else whom I won't name, who's dedicated a big portion of his life and career to very serious analysis of these things, had a kind of similar moment where he goes, I don't know what I'm doing. Like, who listens? But not just that, it's like, how do we even implement some of the things that it seems to me to be sensible to do when the country is in such bad shape at home? And, I've spent 2 stints in the government doing this kind of stuff. And it's hard for me to even grasp too. Like, let's assume we had if Trump had a second term and I were there again for whatever reason, I'd be trying to make that basically that case, which is, look, we need to be focused on overseas on core competencies and things that really matter. Like, so another thing one of the students asked me yesterday was about China. And I said, look, people are trying to tell us right now China's a big threat. Okay, I see that, I get that, and I sort of agree with it. But to me, it's a much bigger economic threat than military or security threat. And right now, what's happening is like the deep state, or whoever you want to call it, permanent Washington, they finally found something they can agree on, which is we got to start getting very rhetorically belligerent about China, but about things like Taiwan and the Spratly Islands and whatever, right? And not about outsourcing and trade and and dumping and industrial espionage and all the things that really affect our economy at home. Like, okay, well, if we're going to have a Cold War with China, which I'm not sure I recommend, but if we're going to have one, can we make it like a trade war and an economic war? Doesn't that make more sense? Isn't that where we're much more vulnerable and more in pain rather than trying to flex muscles that are super atrophied 8,000 miles from home? It's crazy. It seems like kind of the flailing of an insane and or dying regime. I mean, I don't know how they justify these kinds of things.
Right. So we came to this conclusion at a certain point. Angelo did. Our friend who you mentioned did. Many friends have kind of concluded this. I've been thinking that, let's say, a lot of Americans will conclude this once, for example, China will. We wake up one morning to find that China had taken Taiwan. And the whole world is instantly different, and we really we're really put in the place, but under the gun where we have to kind of accept our limitations.
Yeah, I mean, I have to speak about. I'm going down to Orlando later tonight to speak at the NatCon convention. I have to talk about this, but I mean, I think China's plan still is we don't want to have to take Taiwan. We want to get Taiwan the same way we got Hong Kong, with signing a piece of paper and having a ceremony. I teach, I mean, it's a cliched little book, but not a bad book because it's cliched. It's actually, it's a great little book. The famous Chinese classic, Sun Tzu's Art of War. Two of the most famous sentences in that are, number one, to win without fighting is best. And second, he says, the acme of skill is not to destroy, it's to capture something intact, whatever that thing is. It could be a city, it could be a ship, it could be an army, capture it intact, right? So I think the Chinese very much want to win without fighting. They don't want a war. They just want to get Taiwan without having a war. And second, they want to capture Taiwan intact. They don't want to level it and then, invade a smoking island. They want the whole place with all the people and all the buildings and all the industries and the economy and the GDP, and not coincidentally, the semiconductor factories above all.
Sure.
So, one of two things can happen. Anytime I say that, I always think of a third thing. But they can, the status quo can kind of go on, and the balance of power just tips and tips and tips, and the Taiwanese eventually make the deal because they figure this is the best it's ever going to get. I guess, yeah, now there are three things. Or if a military crisis happens, the United States realizes, or I say realizes if this is true. I don't know that it's true, but it calculates, it decides, we don't think we have the force to stop this. And so it backs down and it lets whatever is going to happen. Right? That would be a serious shock to the American national security state, and I think to the American people's sense of what the country's capable of doing overseas. Or the worst case scenario is we charge in and say, okay, we're going to defend Taiwan, and something very bad happens, like the sinking of an aircraft carrier for the first time since the Battle of Midway in June of 1942. That would be a psychological shock, I think, an order of magnitude at least equal to 9/11 and perhaps greater. And the loss of life, by the way, would be almost certainly greater than 9/11, because a fully loaded carrier with the air wing on it and all the pilots and the maintenance crew has got more than 6,000 people.
Right. No, I mean, it would change everything instantly.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, that missile that they launched in August, now it's 24 miles off course, so we're supposedly told not to worry about it. Okay, well, accuracy, the capability is more fundamental than the accuracy, which is a refinement. But before you even get to that, I mean, the people that do net assessment, and I have no special knowledge of this either. I just read open source stuff like everybody else. But there have been assessments, at least going back a decade, that say that the many serious analysts think the Chinese can already sink a U.S. aircraft carrier, and we don't have the capability to defend. I mean, the capability to guarantee that it's not going to happen. I mean, that's what the carrier battle group is all about. It's to provide a ring of protection against your most expensive and most vulnerable asset. And when many of those technologies, such as the Aegis radars and the Phalanx gun and all this stuff, were originally deployed in the 80s, they were absolutely cutting edge and they could defeat anything any other side had. I'm not at all convinced that, I am certain that the technologies potential adversaries have are far greater than they were when those defenses were originally developed. And I'm uncertain that those defenses are capable of stopping these newer technologies that potential adversaries have.
Sure, and that's even before you add to the equation the woke military.
Yeah, and just the subcompetent. I mean, think about the stuff the Navy's been through, crashing 4 ships in 2017, torching a light carrier in San Diego Harbor, burning it and being unable to stop the fire to the point where the ship is now declared a total loss and is being scrapped.
Right.
$4.5 billion or something like that. I mean, yeah. Even before you get to the wokeness, there's just a kind of subcompetence that's crept through the military, as it has crept through kind of almost all of our complex society. There's almost nothing that you can do or go to today that works as well as it did 5, 10, 20 years ago.
Right.
They're more complicated, but they're not better.
I think for Gen X and Boomers, there's kind of an awareness of that in some way, even if it's unexpressed. I think as time goes on and it gets more in your face, it gets expressed more often and with more clarity.
I can only think of a couple of things like in my lifetime. So cars are better in the sense that yes, they're safer. The quality control is higher. They have more features and all that.
They look worse,
but they're very complex and everything has computer. Like the old days of guy taking a Saturday to roll his car out in the driveway and getting underneath and doing a few things. Like that's impossible now because of the complexity of the system. Obviously, microprocessors are a lot faster. There were no cell phones when I was born, and there was, I guess, an internet in use only in the academic setting, but no World Wide Web, right? Those are the only real advances, in a sense, that have happened in my lifetime. And they're at least a mixed blessing. And in particular, the cyberification or the cyber connection of everything, as we've seen, has a serious downside with these ransom hacks. And the ransom hacks are the least of it, because if we really got into it, right, we were talking just about a crisis over Taiwan. Okay, I'm thinking in purely military terms. Well, Chinese don't have to act in purely military terms. There's other ways they can put pressure on the USA that are very scary for us. Right. And that they might do. I was talking to a friend of ours, another mutual friend last night, and I made the point, which he completely agreed with. I don't see how anyone could disagree with this. Like, whatever we think of Taiwan, right? It's the central issue for the leaders of China. It is so utterly important to them. However important it is to us, it's not nearly as important to us. It's just and people will try to interpret that as saying, well, you're saying we should break a commitment or we should walk away. No, I'm just stating it as the fact that, like, before you get into any kind of quarrel or crisis over this, you have to understand the supreme importance of this to them and the rather marginal or relatively peripheral importance of it to us, which means they're going to be willing to go to lengths that are far beyond things that I think our side would rationally contemplate, precisely because of its central importance to them and the way they see the world, the way they see their country, the territorial integrity of their country. If you don't come at an analysis of the crisis without understanding just the mismatch importance of the issue to the two sides, you've already misanalyzed it.
Right. And there's so much bad analysis. I mean, that's even aside, on one hand, you've got so much propaganda out there, and then it seems like what's not propaganda, is actually bad and bullshit analysis. Yeah. Like exactly what you described, like not having.
I mean, I guess I feel like when people, I lived through the Iraq War in the NSC, and there were a lot of skeptics saying, making arguments at the time that this was all ginned up and well, first of all, the argument that this is one concession I'm never going to make. Well, they lied. They deliberately lied about WMDs. No, actually, I think the truth is worse than that. They actually believed what they were saying, and the intelligence was so bad, including the collection, the analysis, all the money spent was so bad they got that catastrophically wrong. I mean, as Talleyrand said, worse than a crime, a mistake. But the drum beating for war, like I've always, being on the right, you tend to take the more hawkish position. You want to be the more, you don't want to be delude yourself. The world's a tough place. You're going to have to keep your guard up and all of that. I usually discounted that. But what I'm seeing now with this kind of bipartisan and almost trans-ideological increase in rhetoric about China is reminiscent of that. It kind of makes me rethink it a little. It makes me wonder if I'm not, drifting toward some kind of weird right-wing dovism. That is to say, look, China is a threat to the United States. I would like Taiwan to remain free, and so on and so forth. But I think if the United States got into a war with China, it would be just about the most catastrophic thing we could possibly do at a moment of such extreme fragility for our country domestically. And to the extent that we are in a conflict with China, which I think we are, I think it's primarily economic, and that's where we're being hurt the most, and that's where I think we need to focus the most.
Yeah, I mean, I went through this too with Russia.
Yeah.
You know, when I realized that, you know, what we know about Russia, basically, or like, let's say the policy conversation around Russia takes place, you know, it's either funded by George Soros on the left or Paul Singer on the, you know, nominal right. And if you want, if you're a Russia expert and you want to make a living in that field inside the Beltway, you've got one of two possible sources of income. So of course this fundamentally skews the conversation.
I teach NSC 68 to students, which is the document, the 1950 top secret, later declassified document that lays out American strategy in the Cold War. And that document, you know, asserts, I think correctly, that this is a not merely a great power, but a superpower with a bunch of satellite countries in its empire that with its combined strength poses a plausible threat to certainly Eurasian conquest and maybe world conquest. Okay. So we have to stand up to it, right? It's just laughable. And I don't mean this as a, you know, any kind of dig at Russia, but it's laughable to look at Russia today and thinks that it's you know, I guess you could point to, well, they took Ukraine and they took, or they, you know, they didn't take Ukraine. They took Crimea and they took this part of eastern Ukraine, which they're still fighting over and have not consolidated control over.
Right. But you can't compare that to the Soviet Union in Africa and Eastern Europe and, you know, Asia. Yeah. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
And in the Americas for that.
Right.
Matter. You know, so it is ridiculous. And this is before we even get to the threat to our democracy. They rigged the 2016 election and all of this hoax. I mean, it's still, unless someone's new evidence has come to light, as far as I looked, the total amount of Russian spending on the 2016 election through, you know, their various intelligence black ops operations was like $10 million. Whoa, right? Hillary Clinton alone officially spent $750 million. And that's before you get to super PACs, party spending, and all of that ally spending, in which case it immediately goes into the billions. Just the campaign itself alone was like 750.
Yeah. No. I mean, it's ridiculous, and that was an eye-opening moment for me because I knew a lot of these people. I mean, we probably both did, who ended up, who were, let's say, Russia hawks for a long time, and then they ended up buying this, and I do think sincerely they did, like what you said about Iraq WMDs. They sincerely bought this. Some of them who are still, considered Russia experts are still believing this nonsense.
To me, one of the greatest ironies or the things that belie all of this is, right, the country that should be the most afraid of, well, I suppose the bordering countries, the Baltics should be the most afraid. They've suffered cyber attacks and things like that. But in the heart of Europe, it's Germany, right? It's Merkel who's the most exercised about Ukraine, Crimea, who was the head of a coalition to try to build Western pressure on these countries and so on. It's always the one most beating the drum that Russia's a problem. And yet this is also a person who's willing to put the future of her country and her entire industrial economy at risk because of this pipeline. Now, the pipeline may make perfect economic sense for Germany. I don't necessarily dispute that, especially once, in a sort of fit of pique, she decided to get out of nuclear power after Fukushima, even though the Germans didn't have such an incident or any kind of problems with their safety record. But whatever, they did that. They had to replace it somehow, right? But it's revealed preference. If you were really that afraid of Russia, if you were really that scared that Russia is still the greatest threat to European peace and security, you wouldn't put your entire economy in hostage to Russia over this pipeline. You just wouldn't. So it says to me somewhere in the subconscious or somewhere deep down, they all realize this is just talk.
Nonsense.
And Russia's not that threatening to us.
Right. No, I agree. And it's something that I think even, the Russiagate and some of these things, what they end up doing is if they go on for long enough and they're successful enough, then the pushback ends up changing the view of even, some of the most hardened boomer cons who, who are like, maybe good people, but they're kind of reliably 5 years behind the 5 years behind the times,
or more, as the case may be.
Right. But I always say, like, if I run into typical typical boomer con, very nice guy, conservative donor type, I feel like the things they tell me are things that I told them 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And and it's not. I mean, in a sense, it's not. I'm not saying they're bad people. They're great people, and they kind of necessarily keep this thing, a lot of this stuff afloat. So my question is, we have this concept of what time it is.
Yeah. A phrase I learned from you.
Yeah. An accurate, an accurate understanding or appraisal of the situation that we're in. Yeah. So let's say you're sitting down with, a kind of, boomer con, normie con type of person. What are the three, I'm picking three from my ass. So what are the three main concepts that you think will sort of bring them to understand what time it is? And I say this like as a strategic comms question as opposed to a philosophical one. So like, what are the three things that you think will likely get them over to understanding what time it is?
You mean like issues?
Yeah, issues or yeah, I mean, probably issues would be the place to start.
I think one of the reasons I came to the views that I have is I'm just the right age to have seen sort of the last of old America while it was working and seen the transition. And I think one issue with people older than I am is their whole formative life was in a different America that worked better and was happier and friendlier and more competent. And it's hard to let that go or to even let yourself believe that it could be slipping away. It's just hard, right? And it was hard believe me, it was not easy for me to do it either. I don't I tell people all the time, nothing would please me more than to be wrong about most of the things that I say, because if I'm right, we're not headed for a very good place. I love to be wrong. And I would gladly take the told you so's until the end of time to have to not experience what we're experiencing and what I think we may yet experience. I guess one of the ways I would do it, I just wrote a piece that is not published, but is going to be in the New Criterion's 40th anniversary. And it just was a one-word title, Unprecedented. And so, well, one of the things that's hard to predict about where we're going, one of the reasons it is because so many things are happening now that have never happened in human history that I know of. That's the thing, maybe the key concept is you say to, like, there's a tendency for people to say, well, these kinds of things always happen and they work themselves out. So like, for instance, one argument we've heard a lot since 2020 became so terrible as well, the 60s were really bad too, but things calmed down. Right. Well, there's a lot of ways though in which what happened in 2020 and 2020 is still going on now is very different than the 60s and worse. There are a number of things that I point to in the piece that are just unprecedented. I think that maybe would be the first concept I would try to say to people is, look, I understand the impulse. You want to believe the best. You want to think, we all want to find reasons to hope, but that hope needs to be on the basis of clarity and reality. And before we hope just for the sake of hoping or be optimistic just for the sake of being optimistic, let's do an accurate assessment of the situation. And we are facing some things that are literally unprecedented, not merely in American history, but as far as I can tell, in human history. And so the way forward is extraordinarily murky because of that. I hope that if I could get that across to people, that might go a long way.
Right. And I think the other piece that's essential is the fact that there is no return.
That's a harder one. I mean, people really definitely don't want to believe that.
Right.
That we can't go back.
It's a hard sell, but once it clicks over and you realize that, I think a lot of things make more sense. And frankly, a white pill door opens.
Yeah. I mean, if by, there's no return in the sense of just a simple restoration where things look the same. But you can go forward and end up at a similar place based on the same principles, but the path is forward. It's not backward to get there, right? In other words, if the things that if the principles in particular, the ideas of what government is supposed to be, what human nature is, what virtue is, and all of those truly are just timeless, as I actually believe that, then that doesn't go away because of a deteriorating situation. It does mean, though, that they're going to have to be not reinvented, but the superstructures and the institutions and all the things that support them are going to have to be remade and look different in a new area and in a new circumstance. I think that's probably true at this point.
Right. Yeah. And getting them to, getting these folks to understand that is, I mean, it's
hard. They think when they hear something like that, what people tend to hear is abandonment.
Yes.
Of America.
Yes.
Abandonment of conservatism, abandonment of civilization, you're giving up. Well, I mean, not really. I mean, the founders weren't giving up on the things that they cared about most when they launched the revolution. They did it in order to protect and preserve those things in a totally new, in a new circumstance, and with new institutions and a new guise.
Right.
Nothing else, sadly, that human beings can build will last forever, whether it's a physical structure or an institution. It just doesn't. The nature of things doesn't work that way.
Right. Which actually leads to the next question that it's very funny how we're going in this direction. Because I think that one of the things that I think a lot of, let's say, normicons need to internalize is the cycle of regimes. And
my part to
yes, no, absolutely, and I think they need to know this because it's sobering, because it flies in the face of like the American myths that are kind of necessary and key in maintaining faith in the regime.
I mean, the very title of your Substack and your podcast,
right.
Late Republic. I mean, where do you get that? I mean, the Late Republic means the cycle of regimes, right?
Yes.
The Late Republic is the decadent, failing republic, which I think we kind of are. I mean, kind of. I can remove the qualifier.
Right. No.
We are a republic. It is a decadent, failing, incompetent republic.
Yeah. No, I agree. So I was going to ask if you could quickly explain it as if you would do in class, because I think there exists nowhere online a short, encapsulation of the concept, and I think you could do a great one.
Okay. Well, first, let me just say the sources in which to go for this are Polybius, Book 6, Machiavelli Discourses on Livy, Book 1, Chapter 2, Florentine Histories, Book 5, Chapter 1, Plato's Republic, Book 8, right? And then I know it's in Aristotle's Politics. I'm blanking on exactly which book. Book 5 is the one about revolutions, but forget that. The idea is just that human beings have a nature, and part of that nature is to, just as a living body is born, grows, matures, decays, dies, any human institution goes through the same cycle, right? It is born, it is, rustic and simple in the beginning. It grows, matures. As it grows and matures and succeeds, it gets wealthy, complex, and powerful. This is inherent to the nature of the cycle of regimes, is that success breeds failure, right? Success breeds, success in terms of wealth and power breed complacency and decadence. So the very virtues that create success, strength, self-reliance, self-denial, deferred gratification, willingness to self-sacrifice, that builds up great wealth and power, well, then people then start to enjoy the wealth and power and neglect the virtues and not practice the virtues. I looked this up. This is a famous internet phrase. I think comes from a self-published novel from some guy whose name I don't remember, so I apologize in advance. It's become kind of a cliche, but it's not a bad summary of the cycle of regimes. It goes something like, hard times make good men. Good men make good times make weak men make hard times. The cycle starts over, right? So your very success breeds the conditions of failure and decline, but the decline leads to the restarting of the cycle, because in a time of stress and deprivation, want, lack of security, lack of resources, it takes strength to survive, and that strength is cultivated and is used to build back up, and then it all kind of starts up again. So this is unfortunate that what human beings cannot do apparently is build a perfect society that is perpetual, right? Is get to that plateau of just enough security and plenty, and not then slide into decadence. But cycle theory would say, no, you're always going to, at some point or another, slide into decadence.
You're right. No, I agree, which is why, it's possible that the late Republic, which is the piece that you wrote in at JAG, at the Journal of American Greatness in 2016, which, I wonder that blog has become kind of like the early Velvet Underground, records, where it's like, 5 people bought it, and it ended up influencing, what was the old saying? 5 people bought it, but they all went on to form bands.
Yeah.
And it was a kind of really influential thing. And it's I think I should publish the piece that you very kindly allowed me to do that about the late Republic, because when I was coming up with the name for this thing, which I came up with a long time ago, I knew that it would have to be Late Republic something, and Late Republic nonsense was the most obvious thing in the world, because
there's plenty of it. There's plenty of, no shortage of Late Republic nonsense. Everywhere you look, it's just, there's nonsense.
So you recently made some waves criticizing, let's say, legacy conservative institutions, including the Heritage Foundation. Since then, they've announced a new president, Kevin Roberts, from formerly of Texas Public Policy Foundation. Do you think? Have you got hopes that that they will change, or that we'll see some good outcomes here?
I'm usually the pessimist in the room, so it's rare for me to say I have hope for anything. I will say this: when I made those comments, Roberts had not been announced as the president, and there's always a lag time between doing an interview and it coming out. It came out and got clipped and went around after he became the president, and I saw that and I thought, immediately thought, oh no, this could look like I'm, bashing this poor guy who may be a good guy. And in fact, several people, including Sorab, who was the one who did the interview with me, told me he's a good guy and he's gonna change the place for the better. He's gonna be really strong. He's gonna be a fighter. He's not the only person who told me that. Other people did too, but he's one whom I will name because I know that he'll have no problem with putting his name on that. And so, based on people I trust, whose judgment I think is sound, vouching for Roberts, I'm willing to give and want to give him the benefit of the doubt, and want to see him take Heritage in a more America First, populist direction that I think it needs to go in on these key issues. And if he does that, I'll be the first to praise him. Not that necessarily he needs or wants my praise. In fact, he might find it more beneficial to his career to be attacked by me. But listen, if Tucker Carlson said something to me once a while ago. This is a name drop, but I'll say it. He said, "Look, I want that place back, and I want all of these legacy. These are our institutions, these conservative institutions. They should be fighting for us and working for us. And I want them. I don't want to get rid of them. I don't want to destroy them. I don't want to replace them. I want them operating properly." I thought, that's the right sentiment. And so I want to see that. I want to see Heritage succeed, but I want to see it succeed doing the things that I think conservatism really needs: fighting for border security, immigration enforcement and limitation, fighting for better trade policy for the American people, economic policy that supports manufacturing in the middle class, fighting for a more, a strong foreign policy, but a more restrained foreign policy that's a lot more focused than the post 9/11 foreign policy that's supported by Republicans and conservatism generally. And if he can make it do all or some of that, I think that would all be positive, and he would have my praise, as I say, to the extent that he needs or wants it.
Right. Great. Interesting. So last question. Who is someone that you could have met but did not and regret it? So like someone who was alive and around, but for one reason or another, either you never made the effort or
that's easy. That's probably for me is Bloom. It's not because I never made the effort. It's like Strauss died when I was 3. Sure. Leo Strauss, for the listeners. Alan Bloom died when I was 22. And his book came out when I was 17. I did exchange a couple of letters with him.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he was teaching at Chicago. I was an undergrad when the book came out. I sort of looked into grad school, but I wasn't ready to go to a PhD program. So I went off to St. John's, which was a great book school in Maryland, and one of his students was teaching at St. John's. I got to know that student very, very well. And while I was there, I think October of 02, so or sorry, not 02, 92, Bloom died, and I would have really loved to. He's probably number one on my, because like a lot of the other people that I really, really admired in life, from a distance, like Wolf or Mansfield, I did eventually get to meet and hang out with, and I feel very blessed for having had those opportunities. I mean, if I had a time machine, the answer would definitely be Leo Strauss. I'd go back to 1949 when he shows up in Chicago and enroll right at that moment, and then just take every class, for the subsequent 17 years he taught there, and then follow him to Claremont. And so I probably would have done that with my life. Whereas Strauss himself, let's assume I were smart enough to be one of Strauss's students, which is by no means self-evident. He probably would say after a while, look, it's time to go. You have to get a job and get out into the real world. You can't just follow me around for the rest of the day.
What are you, some kind of stalker?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Seriously.
He takes out a restraining order. Yeah.
So, Jaffa, he said, Jaffa likes to say for 7 years, he attended every lecture Leo Strauss gave. And that includes well after Jaffa had completed his degree and was working full time. He just happened to they were still in the same city. As long as Strauss was around, he was going to go to every single class. I thought, well, of course you would do that. Why would you? Who cares that you finished your degree? This is not about checking a box or punching a clock. Like, this is about serious learning. And if you can avail yourself of that opportunity. Only a fool wouldn't take it. Right.
Interesting. Excellent. Well, thank you very much. This has been awesome.
Thank you.
And thanks for being here.
Appreciate it.